Okay, good morning. We're up to Siman Kuf Samach Gimel, so a new Siman, and it's a very important, a shortish Siman, but it's an important, very relevant Siman. The first halacha will talk about what happens if you can't get hold of water. So the marshal, you're on a plane and there's turbulence and they don't let you get out of your seat to wash Netilas Yadayim, and you're hungry and you want a sandwich, or you're in a situation where you haven't got water. What do you do? And the second halacha is, what happens if you're feeding someone? Is Netilas Yadayim in a person who's touching the bread or making the sandwich and feeding someone, or is it in the person in the eichel? So that's what's going to be covered by today's siman. Says the Mechaber, Sif Aleph, Im ein mayim mitzuyim lefonov. If water is not available to him, lefonov, in front of him, berichud yosem arba milin, at a distance of arba milin, which we calculate in terms of time. So that normally is understood to mean 72 minutes. So a mil is about 18 minutes, machlokes, but we use that normally, that benchmark. So if there is no water ahead of him for the next 72 minutes, ula achrov mil, or behind him for 1 mil, which is 18 minutes, yitzal yodov b'mapa, you should take your hands and wrap them in a cloth or a material, and then you can eat the bread or something which is normally dipped in liquid, or use a fork or something like that, which the Mishnah is going to question. But the normal way to do it is, if your person's like in the back of a car, you're getting a lift, and they're not going to stop at a service station. There is no service station. There's nowhere to stop. Then what you do is you take some material and you just eat the sandwich in that way without touching it. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Sif Kotan Aleph, Im ein mayim kosov b'yam shel shleima to oisin shenotin yedehim belachus v'asovim, for those people who do Netilas Yadayim by wiping their hands on moist grass, k'she'ein lahem mayim, when they haven't got water available, aveir hi b'yodam, that's an aveira shemezalzlim b'Netilas Yadayim, because they're making sort of cheap Netilas Yadayim, they're sort of treating it a bit flippantly. For gambir chosin levatala here, and to make a bracha on Netilas Yadayim by just wiping your hands on wet grass, that's a bracha levatala she'ein ze netila kolika v'viyah b'prima godim, because that's not really considered Netilas Yadayim. Rather, what you do is if you can't get water, then you follow what the halacha is in this sif, i.e. you take a cloth and you eat it in that way. Mutsuyim. Avol. Kashemayim, says the Mishnah Berurah Cotton Base, Kashemayim Mutsuyim, but when you have got water, Osa af mappa, then you cannot use this mappa, dilma osi laminga, because you might come to touch the bread. The whole problem is touching the bread. And therefore, if you either wash your hands so that you make it sure your hands are tahar, or you take a mappa, you take a cloth and you cover the bread. But the whole concern is by using a mappa is you might come to touch the bread. And mashenken, if your hands are tahar, it's a much safer way of doing it. The fun of Berich Yosef, says Mishnah Berurah Sif Kotan Gimel, when you're going on a journey, and you estimate that you're not going to have water, af Berich Yosef, even in a longer distance, me'arba milin, v'hu sheroit zelechon, the guy's hungry, he wants to eat, oz hetiru lelechol al yedei krichas mappa al yodov, by putting some sort of material of your hands. But if he knows, for example, there's a service station that they're going to stop and there's water available just after 72 minutes, you should wait. And afterwards, going behind you, going back, it's a bit of a pain. Imagine you're driving to Manchester and there's a service station you just passed. So to go back is a little bit of a nuisance, it's a bit of an inconvenience, and therefore it's a shorter shear. Sagi b'shir mil, it's enough to have 1 mil, that's your cutoff, which is 18 minutes. When you estimate there won't be water, mutal al yidei mappa, then if it's going to be more than 1 mil going behind you, then you can use a map or you use the cloth and you can just eat your sandwich. For kosvu achrinim, not only if you're certain, but even if you're not sure, maybe there will be water there, maybe there won't be, then that's also enough that you can use the map or you can use this cloth. For the guy's hungry, for shemrei ganus or pardesin, watchmen, and people like that, when they need to go and get water, for them they've got slightly different halacha. They always have the shear of 1 mil, and they can't just abandon their post, and therefore we always give them the share of a mill. Someone who is stationary, we don't make him go 4 mil. When do we say 72 minutes? When in any event you're going in that direction. So the marshal, the guy is on an EasyJet bus. He's going on a coach to London to Manchester. It's a 4-hour coach drive, and let's say the bathroom doesn't work in the coach, and therefore he wants to have a sandwich. He doesn't want to sit there the whole journey and not eat some of his lunch. So then the bus driver is not planning on stopping, or not for a while. So then he's got 72 minutes. If they're going to stop within 72 minutes, then you're okay. Then you can have your sandwich. But if he is stationary, let's say he's in a camping and there's no water around, and then the shear is the same as going back, he will only have 18 minutes. That's your cutoff. Okay, that's the general rule. But Mappo says the Mishnah Berurah Sif Katan Hey, Oibashum Davo is lav dafka a cloth, or any interposing thing where it's not actually touching the bread. That's very interesting. You're having a sandwich with one hand. Do you have to cover one hand with material, or is it both hands? So he quotes here that the Bir Halacha that you need both hands. The Afsha Eicha Ba'achaz, even though Lemaisi you're only eating with one hand, Shem Meyiga B'Chaverta, the second hand might come to touch the bread. Omnom L'das Ramah Yesh L'Hakal B'Zeh V'Tzorchian. The Ramah, according to the Ramah, you could be Mekel, but Tzorchian. B'Mashke. So the Mechaber had said not only for eating bread, but also for things which are dipped in water or liquids, like we said previously in Siman Kuf Nun Ches. If you haven't got a material, it's a cloth or something to hold, a tissue or something to hold the sandwich in, or to cover your hands, then it's muta afpele mapo, given the ein lo yochel hasig mayim b'shezeh, because you can't get water. Ach be'emes hu davar she'ein matzu. That's very unusual. The otu begavrat lo yaskilon the les b'shum suda she'el yochel dichrich yodav boy. Are we so barren that we haven't even got some material that we can't find? Or b'vadai mechuyev lasis kein. You should certainly try and find some material. The Orach, the matzrich mapa lav yechidahu. The Orach who says you've got to find some material is not a das yochid. The Gam Harach b'Perush Psachim shezochin atzel eirei. The Rabbeinu Hananel, we've just now discovered his manuscripts. Very interesting. Many of the Rishonim, they've only came across them fairly recently. Many of them here in England, in Oxford and other places. The Meiri was found quite late in the Rabbeinu Hananel. Anyway, we've just come across it, says the Mishnah Berurah, Bedaf Menvav Kosov Behedjakain. Ali Dei Kaf. Now the Ramah says at the end, if you can't find, or either you use a mappo, or Ali Dei Kaf, you use a fork. Achronim niskashu b'zeh. The Achronim question this Ramah. Where does the Ramah get this from? V'shani mappa sheyodem mechus. On the contrary, the mappa is much better because your hands are covered. Mashein kein b'zeh sheyodem megula, because with the case of a fork or something, your hands are exposed. Chashin and tfeidim oselaminga, and therefore it's more likely, we're more worried you may come to touch the bread. Over Eli Rabbi Yishve b'deichek, he explains, albeit in a forced way, the mahalach of the Ramah. It's certainly better to use a mappa than the eitzah of the Ramah to use a kaf. Okay, next sif. Says the Mechaber, Hamachil ala acherim. If someone feeds others, einay tzarich Netilas Yadayim. He does not need to wash Netilas Yadayim. V'oichel tzarich Netilas Yadayim. But the person eating the bread, he needs Netilas Yadayim. Afa pisha acher noisim l'toich piv. Even though somebody is feeding him, is putting it in his mouth, and the person who's eating is not actually touching the food, still he is the one who needs to wash Netilas Yadayim. And so too a person uses an implement, a fork or something, pirish kli sheyesh shinaim, fork balaz l'chayr, it means fork, shetzorch Netilas Yadayim, even though you're not touching the bread, Chazal will go there that you need to do Netilas Yadayim. V'asa laha'achil l'mishalei notel yadov, and you can't feed someone who has not washed his hands. Mishum lifnei evelo sits in michshel. Okay, we'll come to that in a situation. You can imagine there are issues for in secular Jews and kiruv and things like that. That's going to be relevant. Says the Mechaber Sif Katan Ches, the Mishnah Berurah Sif Katan Ches, Ein tzorich Netilas Yadayim. So the person who is machil, who is feeding somebody else, you imagine you've got a carer, or you've got a child who's feeding a parent, or a parent who's feeding a child, or something like that. he or she does not need to wash their hands, only the person eating. Afa pishin ager b'meichel, says the Mishnah Berurah, even though that person is touching the food, Chazal were only mesakim for the person eating. Afa pi, that even though the person eating is not touching the food, the loy plug rabban ba'eichel bein nager le'ein nager, because the Levush says it's loy plug. It doesn't make a difference if the person eating touches the food, touches the bread or not. Either way, Chazal mesakim that the eichel has got to wash. If we are in eichel b'magref, and so too someone who uses a fork, the loy odif me'eichel machmas machal the tzorich netila. It's no different who's eichel machmas mach, who's being fed tzorich netila. So too a person who uses a fork also uses netila. Lemisha nosel yadov. So the Ramah says at the end, it's osel lahachil. You can't feed someone who hasn't washed Netilas Yadayim mishum lifnei iver. V'dafka b'yodua sheloi notal, and dafka where we know for sure he hasn't washed his hands. Al v'sofik muta keinu lefi ma shetzided hamogen Avram b'simen kuf samachtes kotzen hey ayin shom. Of a prat de la'oni, but Torah stock. Imagine, an oni comes to your door and you want to give him a loaf of bread, you want to give him a sandwich. But vada ein lahachmer besofik. You don't have to be so machmir that, hey, how do I know he's going to wash his hands? You don't have to be so worried. Ayin shom besif beis. So mikol makom tov k'shenois an oni shelo kimlei begaveh. If you want to give to an oni and you're not sure whether he's going to wash his hands, sheyoma le'echol sheyoma, you say to him, kun notol yadecha, come wash Netilas Yadayim. That would be the best thing to do. Mishum lifnei iver, tahanu belechem shel, because it's my bread that I'm giving him, and therefore there's a shaila of lifnei iver. I'm facilitating his eating without Netilas Yadayim. The belechem shel ha'ochel v'yuchel likach zman, because if it's his sandwich and his bread, ein kan lifnei iver, because that's his choice. Mikol makom kos v'achrinim de'osa gam b'zeh mishum de'osa leman l'sayei de'avera. To feed someone or to give someone to enable his avera, that's a problem. So take a look at number 7. So the big shaila over here, we've said in Sif Beis, is that if you're machil acherim, you don't need Netilas Yadayim, only the oichel themselves. And then the Ramah says at the end, osel lahachil l'mishel nosel yadov, because of lifnei iver. So look at number 7. Misha yadea shelo yitel yadov or lo yivarich. What if you've got someone at your table, or a builder in the house who you know is not going to wash, and you want to give him some lunch, you want to make him a sandwich. And even if you say to him, come wash until this time, he's not going to listen to you. What do you do? If you don't behave in a nice way, and it's rude if you don't give him something to eat. And it might be a chil Hashem. He might come to hate those who are Shomerei Torah mitzvahs. Kosav b'shas shuvas igros Moshe. Moshe Feinstein writes, "Sheish lachshos lechil Hashem. Sheyem she'elu Shomerei mitzvahs geruim b'midaseim." They're rude, impolite people. Lachein mutar lahamid lefonav eichel v'yom lo shetzarich levarich. And you say to him, here, have this and make a bracha, wash, etc. Or lepas yom lo gam nitzel yadov. V'im lo yirzi and if he doesn't want to, then that's his choice. Because otherwise, if it's going to cause a chil Hashem, then that's not your concern. Then he goes on maybe a second time not. You've seen that he doesn't do it. He knows that you're a nice person and you've got nice midas, etc. Maybe a second time not. Look at the next paragraph. You're allowed to give him food. It's saving him from a bigger michshel. It will put him off. It will distance him further from Torah. For sin, etc., etc. Next paragraph, the difference for the Shevet HaLevi. He also is matzirit with other heterim. If you don't give him a sandwich, he'll go to McDonald's to have his lunch. So therefore, better let him eat kosher at least, even though he hasn't washed until this time. Just one final thing. He says at the end of footnote number 9, if you give food to a chiloni, to a secular Jew, and you want him to make a bracha, or to bench, or to wash, or to bench, and to make brachas, you have to get him to put a couple on. So ideally, you say to him, here, come, cover your head, put a couple on, etc. But that's not ma'akiv. If he's not going to put a couple on, that doesn't mean you shouldn't give him a sandwich. So what have we said today? 2 important halachas. If you can't find water, you're going either ahead of you 72 minutes or behind you or stationary 18 minutes, you just cover your hands with material or cover the bread so that you're not touching it. That is the eitzah. And or b'diavad, I guess, according to the Ramah, you use a fork or something without touching it. And the second halacha siv base is when you feed the others, a din in the eater, not in the preparer or the toucher of the food. And therefore, if you're feeding somebody else, it's the person eating who needs to wash Netilas Yadayim, not the person who's touching the food. And lastly, the Ramah said, "Asa lahachil mishum yadov mishum lifnei iver," but again, mishum, chil Hashem and other things, to give your builder, your worker, food, even though you encourage him and he doesn't want to. That's not your problem. You should.